It's 20 Macs for 2020. I'm Jason Snell here, as always, with Stephen Hackett. Stephen, you may be asking yourself, Jason, why do you have a beige PC clone in your hands right now?
Yeah,
This
you.
is not a
So
Mac.
on the 20 Mac list, you have a computer that's not a
It's not a
Mac. I
Mac.
mean, I know you invented this, but what's going on over there?
Why would I make a really boring metal box assembled in Austin, Texas, right next to the Dell factory by a bunch of ex-Dell people, a Mac? And the answer is this is a power computing computer, and it ran
That's
Mac
right.
OS. This is a Mac clone. And although the PowerBase 240 is not what I would probably choose as the best power computing Mac, it was the one that was on eBay when I was working on this project. So I'm using it as an example. I had a Power
Sure.
Wave, which was a tower, which was a little bit nicer, I think, than this system was. But, this is the era, and I felt like I needed to talk about it, where some of the favorite Macs and some of the best Mac buying experiences were from companies like Power Computing. They were the primary one. I want to honor them. But there were other clone makers as well. Motorola sold clones, UMAX sold clones. This was mainstream. Like, regular people could just go to the Power Computing website. It was actually, at least they claim, and I think they're probably right, the first website you could go to and configure to order by spec a computer and have it shipped to you. And I did that in the
Wow.
90s. It
Wow.
was great. You could call Dell and say, hey, Dell, assemble this for
Sure.
me, assemble 50 of these for my business or whatever. But Power, I think, was the first one to do it on the web. And they were great systems. They had a lot of advantages over Apple because Apple had their big sales channel, and Apple was this big company, and they were kind of inefficient, and they sold tens of thousands of each Mac model, and they had all these corporate deals and things like that. And Power was selling direct to consumers. They didn't have the volumes Apple did. They built them in the way that computers are built now, by the way. They built them as sort of just-in-time configure to order, which was a lesson learned from Dell that the whole industry does now. Tim Cook is all about that. But at the time, Apple would just build thousands and thousands of Macs and keep them in inventory, and Power didn't have to do any of that. And that also means that, and their proximity to Motorola in Texas meant that they got access to PowerPC processors a little earlier than Apple did, the faster, newer ones, because Apple couldn't ship them until they couldn't announce a new Power Mac with a new processor until they had access to thousands of them. And Power could get 500 and say, we announced that we've got the fastest Mac. And they did it again and again and again. And if you wanted to be on the cutting edge, it's not like Apple's computers were particularly good then. They were beige boxes too. They just weren't quite as beige and quite as boxy as this, but they were. And so, it was an era where all sorts of people got Macs that weren't Macs, and I was one of them.
Yeah, I think Power did way more damage to Apple than the other clone makers because they were going to consumers, because they could be in the press and say, we have made a faster Mac than Apple. Yeah, there were other clone companies that maybe did things more impressively on the technology side, but I think Power Computing is really the reason that the clones program it's kind of like the worst case scenario for Apple was Power Computing, and they ate Apple's lunch for a while
Yeah.
there. And I think that it's interesting looking back now, so many years later, seeing the decisions that Power Computing made that were right. So a lot of the stuff that you talked about, how that became the norm, and they were one of the first companies to do a lot of that stuff, and that's pretty cool.
At a time when Apple's marketing was super boring and sedate, and people would complain about how boring Apple's marketing was and how Apple wasn't making the case for why the Mac was great. And Power Computing got it. It was loud, it was aggressive, and it was exactly what Mac users in that very dark time, very bad time for Apple, and being a Mac user and the feeling that Windows was taking over the world, which it was, that they had these, we're fighting back from the Mac ad campaign. Let's kick Intel's ass was one of their slogans that they put on a t-shirt. And there was, you can take my Mac when you pry it from my cold dead hands. That was a Power Computing ad. And we felt that. And so for Power to do that, they got Mac users at a time when Apple started the clones because they thought they could expand the market. And the truth is that, yeah, I think Power ended up marketing to Mac users and eating Apple's lunch. But it also revealed just how sedate and boring, and how really Apple had lost its way. And that's why when Steve Jobs came back, first thing he did was kill the clones by any means necessary. There was a version of Mac OS that was going to be System 7.8 or something, and they made it Mac OS 8. And the reason they did that is legally the clone license was for System 7.
Right.
And so that was
we
that
never
was enough.
saw that,
They couldn't
that version.
They couldn't ship a new version. They couldn't ship G3 processors. In the end, they faded away. But the clone era was really interesting and relevant. It was probably a bad decision on Apple's part to even try it. It showed you how weak Apple was, that they were getting beat by these upstarts. It showed you how complacent they were. All of the symptoms that led to Steve Jobs taking over and remaking the company. But for a shining moment there, as somebody who worked at a magazine during this period, we had new Macs and Mac clones to talk about every month. They were fighting with each other over specs. They were advertising, which was really great for our budgets. It was a really exciting time to be courted by all of these different companies. As a Mac user, you just have to buy from the source, right? From the state-run grocery store. It's just Apple products only, please. And then all of a sudden, it's like, oh, but Power and Umax and all of these different clone makers were out there. It was a great time.
Yeah, a wild time. And to think about Apple being the hardware, software, services all together company they are now, it really makes this decision to do clones seem like from another universe almost.
Yeah, if it had worked and they had turned into something more like Microsoft as the head of a company that was licensing their operating system, or even something like Microsoft today, where they're making some very specific high quality representations of hardware on their platform, but there's lots of room for clone makers, or PC makers as we just call them. They're not even clones anymore. They're just PCs. It would be a different story, but it was too late. It didn't work. Windows had too much momentum. And so, yeah, it's a parallel universe where Apple became more like Microsoft than it ended up being. And honestly, in that universe, also Steve Jobs didn't come back. So, because Steve Jobs was never going to be about running a licensing program for operating systems. That was not going to be his thing. Anyway.
No way.
A Mac that's not a Mac is one of the 20 Macs for 2020. As always, I'm Jason Snell with Stephen Hackett. We'll be back next week with another computer that probably was made by Apple.
I hope so.
Bye, Stephen.
Bye, Jason.